Welcome to episode 2 of the Lowdown show. I'm Neil Graham. My guest is Zac Kurylyk, ADVrider's man for all seasons. Zac, despite his youth, has led a curious existence. He credits his time as a commercial fisherman for forging his vigorous work ethic. Born on Prince Edward Island, known as Canada's oft-forgotten province, Zac currently lives in New Brunswick, a province that better suits his temperament. A hunter, a fisher, a father, and a follower of no trends, Zac is a man that resists temptation in all its forms. But before we dive in, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Shall we take the plunge? So you wrote a lovely piece for ADVrider.com a couple of years ago about why is Johnny not buying a motorcycle? And the gist of it was this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here. Young men are not buying motorcycles the way they used to. And there's so much hand-wringing in the industry, in the motorcycle industry, and guys like us and who are so concerned about motorcycling and the future of motorcycling. And I understand that because you and I make some sort of income from this, and obviously the OEMs make money from selling motorcycles. But part of me thinks, why are we so concerned? Who cares? Like, I'm not concerned about the bowling lobby or the, step ladder lobby or whatever else is out there. So what is it about motorcycling that, why is this important, or is it important to you?
It is important to me. I want other people to take up motorcycling, continue it into the future, but I don't necessarily view myself as a moto apostle. In other words, I don't care if my kids or my friends and relations take up motorcycling. That's their choice. And I leave that up to them. But I hope that motorcycling continues. And I think it's important for more people to buy new motorcycles because I want to keep motorcycling. Not because I want to keep working as a motojournalist, but because I want to keep motorcycling. And I'm afraid that if we lose enough mass in the industry, it's going to make life much more difficult for all of us.
But you can always have a motorcycle yourself. Why do you feel this need for mass participation? Why is that important?
I'm not so sure that I can always have a motorcycle myself if people get away from it. I mean, on some level, yes, I could probably have a dirt bike, an electric dirt bike forever. But as laws change and as society gets more and more safety conscious and anti-pollution around us, I feel that motorcyclists are in danger of losing some of our rights just because we don't have enough people to stand up for them. And I'm also somewhat concerned that if there's not enough money coming in from us, from buyers, then the industry will lose interest in this and spend money on other things and develop other machines, not motorcycles.
So do you think that motorcycling to exist for all of us needs a critical mass of participation? Then below a certain point where we're no longer relevant, we're like, I don't know, the Green Party or something, in effect that we're so suppressed in our participation that we cease to exist?
I don't think that we would 100% cease to exist, but I could see motorcycling becoming the pastime of the rich. They might be the only people who can afford to go to the track or to rent off-road riding space. It's crazy as that stuff sounds. I've seen it in other hobbies and pastimes. Look at hunting, for instance, in Europe. If you want to hunt, you have to have access to a private hunting club in many countries, not all. And this is increasingly becoming the case in the United States at this point as well. A combination of commodification of everything in the world, plus a lack of people to stand up for our own rights, I believe will result in the things we enjoy becoming more expensive and indeed out of reach out of many motorcyclists. And also, I believe that we will lose rights on the public roads and to public spaces.
I mean, you could sort of make the argument, I think, already that motorcycling is a pursuit of the rich. Now, you and I are not rich by North American standards, but by global standards, to most people in the world, we're wealthy. Your filing cabinets aside. But you get my point, right? That already motorcycling as a luxury pursuit, and I'm not talking about people in Southeast Asia with 125 scooters. I mean, with large capacity motorcycles. I mean, motorcycling is already such a luxury. I wonder if what's happening now is that really if one of those changes are already taking place. I mean, if the early 70s, when baby boomers got into motorcycling, which is kind of what your article talks about, now there are more distractions, and I think there's also a loss of romance around movement. I don't think there was a romance with cars. There was a romance with motorcycles. I'm not sure that quite exists in the same way, because we're aware of the ramifications of pollution, and there's congestion, and there's the cost and insurance. I wonder if that transition is already taking place into it becoming a luxury pursuit for the wealthy.
In North America, that is certainly the mindset of many motorcyclists. I see it all the time. People say motorcycling is an expensive pursuit. You have to spend this much money on your bike. Then you have to buy all this gear. You have to spend. And I disagree. It's no doubt that for many people, it is an expensive hobby. But as someone who commuted only by motorcycle, there was much of my 20s, I only owned a motorcycle. I owned no car. It was my way around. And even later on, when I moved out to the country and I had to have a car to get to work in the winter, I still used my motorcycle for access to places I could not afford a big four-wheel drive truck. I couldn't afford an ATV. I used my motorcycle to access fishing places and hunting spots I just couldn't get to otherwise, because it was the most affordable way to get around. I think the affordability of motorcycling is what makes it popular in a lot of developing countries. And we even saw that in the West, not so much in North America, but certainly in Europe after World War II. There was a boom era for small motorcycle companies and small motorcycles as Europe rebuilt after the war with limited resources. And I actually suspect we may be headed back towards such a situation as Western motorists begin to realize they can't afford a new car and they need a fuel-efficient vehicle. I actually think we might see some interest in motorcycles as a result. My only concern is that those of us already in the industry will have made the cost of entry so high that they can't get in.
Well, it's true that I think those of us who do, I mean, I'm a former editor of a motorcycle magazine. You're the guy in charge of content at ADVrider.com. And there is this thing that happens where essentially it's like pornography. You're creating pornography, at least the mainstream magazines. You're always photographing a bike in a beautiful setting, and you're going to these press launches. And you're creating this unrealistic expectation. And I think that people feel that they need that. I mean, how many riders do you see on, big GS BMWs and multistradas and so on with the full gear, and they're just going to Starbucks? It's so much of an adoption of a lifestyle that I think we've gotten away from just the notion that it's just of the freedom to be on something that's inexpensive. And I also think another truism of life, this is as close as I come to being a philosopher, is that the less you spend on something, the more you get out of it. I think there's an inverse relationship. Did I get that right? Inverse relationship. Do you know what I mean? Like, and you're kind of you're a quirky guy because you live in New Brunswick, first of all, and you have a shed like that. But also, for a guy in his late 30s. Is that how old you are? Yeah. I mean, you're like a 70s motorcyclist. Like you'd be the kind of guy that I'd see like that, like a moose head strapped to the back of your bike. And I know you do stuff like that. So you're very much in the vein of what I used to see when I was a kid in the 70s. And so you're kind of this anomaly in a way. And which I find really interesting. I don't know, is there a question in there? I don't know. Um, I think we got off topic, but I just think that I think spending less in some ways is the ultimate freedom, and I'm not sure that those of us in motorcycle media or the manufacturers have almost contributed to our own demise by making everyone think they need the latest and greatest.
If I was going to give anybody advice for adventure motorcycling, I'd sum it up in 4 words: spend less, do more. Now, if you're doing more, you will eventually spend more, but the emphasis needs to be on the doing, not on the spending. One of my greatest motorcycle heroes, I guess you could call him, would be Ed March and his Honda C90 that he rode across Canada in the winter. There was a bit of time there where I thought, it would be fun to come up with some difficult trip, and film it or write a book about it and do all, this media presentation. And then when Ed and his girlfriend rode across Canada in the winter on their Honda scooters, I just thought, well, there's that. There's no point. Nobody can top that. But it didn't cost them very much. They just went out and did it.
Well, people like that I find sort of interesting in quotation marks. That just seems like just hurting yourself for fun. I don't know. I mean, I totally don't get that sort of thing. I mean, I know there's a lot of people that do stuff like that. Well, not a lot, but some people do that. But maybe the point is just that you survived it and didn't die. And I understand the appeal of that, having raced for years. But, I was talking to someone the other day, and I guess that Honda has sold out of that Trail 125. I guess you just can't get them anymore because the other, they're just selling like crazy. And I think there's a throwback to, at least I like to think there's a throwback to when things were inexpensive. But I think we're missing. I think what's maybe missing is a cachet around spending less. Like you think of the VW Beetle, or in Italy the Fiat 500. Who had the vehicles with a cachet that aren't the biggest and the most expensive, but there's something about them. And maybe bikes like the Trail 125 are a return to something that's covetable, not because it's expensive, but very much the opposite, that it's not expensive. And I guess you could extend that to things like the KLR 650 and DR 650 and all these bikes that people think of as stepping stones to bigger things, but maybe we shouldn't keep stepping.
I would definitely agree with that. I think this is a key part of what's made Royal Enfield successful in North America, is because they're bikes that you can buy and they're good enough. You can get on it. It looks good. You don't need to upgrade. If you buy a 650, that's already the biggest bike they make anyway. If you buy their 450 adventure bike, that's the biggest adventure bike they sell. I think that back in the 70s, now I wasn't around then, but in the 70s, there was an emphasis on motorcycling as a cost-saving, money-saving activity. And you can see it in the old advertisements. There's that Kawazacky advertisement with the college guy, and he's got his girlfriend in his dorm room and his tennis rackets and everything. And it talks about, how cheap his Z400 is to ride around. Another Kawazacky ad, I remember, they talk about how you can do the quarter mile for $600 or something like that, and compared to a muscle car at the time. I've never seen an ad like that in my lifetime. I can't remember ever seeing one. And maybe we need to get back to some of that.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. Yeah, I was just looking at some vintage ads the other day, and that you meet the nicest people on a Honda. There was something so really beautifully naive, and maybe it doesn't fit with our era or the time anymore, but there was something really wonderfully optimistic about that time and about when motorcycling was in the boom years. And it was kind of sweet and kind of naive, and we're not sweet and naive in our culture anymore. You're listening to the Lowdown Show, presented by ADVrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. So since we were just talking about the 70s, a decade I know, the lure of motorcycling for me then was that there was a guy at the end of my street had a Norton Commando. And every time he went by, like in the cartoons where they kind of, you get the blur behind and they kind of whip. They don't actually, every time this guy went by, it was just all noise and hair. And he always seemed like he had a date with the devil. I mean, he never just went down the road. It was always, he was either fleeing a fire or going to a fire. And so that was my image of motorcycling. Now, I think of my daughter who's a teen, and her image of motorcycling, I hate to say it, but it's kind of fat guys on cruisers, which is a lot of what the contemporary motorcycle scene is, at least of what she's seen and the way she's expressed it to me. So I think, or I wonder if motorcycling has gone from this counterculture to something that seems so conservative and within the culture that I mean, kids who naturally want to rebel against their parents, which they're obligated to do, whether it be with music or whatever, that the motorcycle is no longer seen as the vehicle in which you can oppose what your parents believe in. Because my mother hated motorcycles, which of course made them infinitely more desirable to me. So I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
I would say that you're right. And in fact, I would say that there are organizations and maybe even motorcycle manufacturers out there that have actually tried to make this happen. I mean, you think about the Moto Social Club that started in Toronto, but it's all over the world now. I mean, they're very much, good vibes only. There's no emphasis on, sticking it to the man there. There's no good vibes in sticking it to the man. And they're quite successful. So obviously some people are into that message. I think every few years, Harley Davidson feels the need to push this countercultural attitude in motorcyclists. And that's why we see shows like Sons of Anarchy come up. It's to remind, hey, everybody, motorcycles are owned by dangerous people. I note that the Bike Riders movie is now slated for a July release, I believe. It was supposed to be out in December, but Sony dropped it. I don't know if you'd seen that. Anyway, I do think that you're right. I think once that Harleys became the status symbol of rich urban bikers, and now I believe adventure bikes, to a certain extent, are headed that same direction. There's no point in buying or aspiring to these bikes to be a counterculture rebel. No one's telling you that you can't, be a successful dentist and own a Harley, because that's who bought them for years. Whether that's good or bad for motorcycling, I can't say. I will say that if you get into a place where there's an underground scene, I think of those movies, maybe they were 15 years ago or so, Chopper Town, the Sinners, I think. If you know guys like that, guys who are actually hardtailing their bikes and doing, hard miles on them, that stuff will always be countercultural because it's just uncomfortable, and they were doing it themselves. You can't buy that level of involvement because the involvement is all just hard work and physical skill, and you can't pay for that. So I think that will always be countercultural. But of course, that doesn't really relate to adventure biking because very few people are adventure biking around the world on hardtail motorcycles.
Well, the notion of the countercultures I find interesting because I don't think it's counter anymore. I think it is the culture. And I mean, the Honda Shadow comes from, panhead choppers, comes from Easy Rider and 60s biker movies. And, what I find kind of hard to believe, I'm, in my 50s, and I remember a time doing a road trip down through Ohio with a friend of mine. We had a couple of old Triumphs, say, 30 years ago. But there were places then that would not rent motel rooms to motorcyclists. In fact, we were going through this little town. It was raining and miserable, and my friend was suffering from hypothermia and shivering. And I had to beg the woman to rent us a motel room, and we had to park our bikes around the back. And we're clean-cut kids. We got short hair. But that's in my lifetime. I mean, it's not long ago. That's the beginning of the 90s. So. And now, of course, motorcyclists are this economic force, and every region is, coveting the motorcyclist, come and make noise in our town. So I just think that without that countercultural cachet, I just think it makes it much less interesting to a certain kind of young person. And
A
not
certain
not a
kind
young,
of young person who bought, or at least aspired to the lifestyle.
yeah, but I think the lifestyle is a very broad term. And I think, the lifestyle can be just anything your parents aren't into, or it can be, the outlaw biker lifestyle. But very few people do that. But even these scenes now, you're talking a second ago about these guys that ride, hardtail choppers. But that scene in effect is kind of like community theater, because they're just aping a scene. They want to be like guys like going from LA to Frisco in '68. I mean, it's a scene that's pretending to be something else. In fact, I was looking at some photographs on a site recently, and these note perfect panhead choppers, and the guys, and I thought they were period photographs from the '70s. And then I saw a Prius parked in the background of the shot. And I thought, wow, these guys have it perfectly replicated. And so I just wonder if there is any, is there an original outlaw scene now that isn't just pretending, like you mentioned, the bike riders, which is, and I know a little bit about the film, but I also, it's a book by Danny Lyon, Bike Riders, where he joined the Chicago Outlaws in the late '60s and did a wonderful, wrote about them and took photographs, and sort of a classic of photo literature. So I just find it kind of curious that are there any original outlaw scenes? And I would say there is one, and I know it's very contentious amongst motorcyclists, and I know everyone hates it except I love it, which is these guys that take over towns on dirt bikes in Baltimore or wherever it is, all over the place, San Francisco, and just they're true outlaws. They do wheelies down, they close down roads. Every motorcyclist, the AMA gets against it, but those are the true outlaws of today. And yet we don't make the correlation between, the Hollister in 1948 or whatever it was, and these guys now. But they're the badasses, right? And I love them for it.
I mean, I think you're right. That's kind of what my mind would have gone to as well. If you read the books by the old outlaw clubs, they weren't good guys. They were out funding their lifestyle by stealing motorcycles and just generally being, thugs. And that's what the bike life scene is too. And most of these guys aren't necessarily going out and buying themselves a KTM dirt bike with their hard-earned money. They're stealing stuff from other people and stunting on the street with it. Certainly not all of them, but some of them. And I think maybe some people in inner cities aspire to that. I don't know. I don't know. Like the original outlaw clubs, I don't know if it'll grow motorcycling. Whether it'll be good for it in the long term is another question.
Well, I don't think, I don't know if it's good for it or bad for it. It just is. It's like the weather. But everything, I guess my point is that everything becomes softened over time, because, biker clubs in the '60s and '70s terrified everyone. The Satan's choice would go through my town and everyone would just, pull the blinds. But now it's seen as kind of quaint. Now it's time has taken it from something that was fearful to something that's kind of retro cool. And 30 years from now or 40 years from now, these guys that take over these inner city with dirt bikes and do wheelies through Times Square, I mean, that'll be seen as quaint too. That's just how the culture works. It's like Elvis. Elvis was seen as corrupting the youth of the age. Now, of course, Elvis is well, first of all, he's not dead, and secondly, it's seen as sort of charming. And now a word from our sponsor, after which I'll throw a log in the fire and share a heartwarming tale. eBay Motors is here for the ride. Let's talk about my first bike, a Combat Wombat by a cut-rate Japanese brand, Hodaka, that would be entirely forgotten were it not for the inventiveness of its model names. But that's not what we're here to talk about. Names, maybe another day. The Combat Wombat was a motocrosser, a 125, purchased for $50 from a coworker on the farm where I picked zucchinis. I was 14. The seller, a suave 16-year-old boy named Buck, neglected to tell me that the disassembled Hodaka's engine resided in the trunk of his ex-girlfriend's father's car. No explanation was offered as to why this was the case. By then, Buck had my money, but he also had a key to the ex-girlfriend's father's car. Late one night, I met Buck at his house, and we walked the 3 blocks to his ex-girlfriend's house. As Buck promised, the car, a Buick Electra, was parked in the carport. However, it was a starless night. The moon had taken its leave, and we left the flashlight back at Buck's. We silently opened the trunk, found the cardboard box by feel, searched around by hand for errant parts, then safely retreated to Buck's house. The next day, while inspecting the parts on my father's workbench, I realized we'd inadvertently taken the Buick's tire iron. I promptly returned it to Buck, and he promised to repatriate it to the Buick's trunk, though I always harbored a degree of suspicion that Buck took it back. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. So as we all know, we live in the age of misinformation, and where some people will believe things that I think are highly implausible, but they will take it as gospel. Now, Zac here contributed to the noise a few years ago, and of course, because we're coming up to April 1st, Zac, take us through the story and the ramifications of what happened after you did this a joke that kind of got mildly out of control.
Yeah, it wasn't just mildly, it was madly out of control. This was a story. I was working with Mark Richardson at Canada Moto Guide. Canada Moto Guide, we had a long tradition going back when Rob Harris was the boss. We'd always do April Fool's story. And it was always something kind of ridiculous. And we usually made fun of Harley or Honda or BMW, somebody that was kind of a stock player that, you had the stereotype that you could play off of. So we wanted to do something different. And Mark said, I think it was Mark's idea, let's do something about the Cabot Trail. Let's say motorcyclists are banned from the Cabot Trail. Now, if you're not from Eastern Canada, this probably doesn't mean much to you, or maybe the Eastern US. But the Cabot Trail is this paved road that goes around Cape Breton Island on Canada's east coast. And it's considered to be this world-class riding destination. I've ridden it a few times. It's a good riding destination. I think it's overrated. I think there's better riding in Cape Breton off the Cabot Trail, and I am not going to tell you where it is, but it's there. But people come from all over North America to ride the Cabot Trail. So we thought, this would be a funny...
Let me just jump in. So, I mean, the Cabot Trail, I think for motorcyclists in Eastern Canada, it would be like banning motorcyclists on the Stelvio Pass in Italy. I mean, it's one of those things that it's such a destination that the idea that motorcycles would be banned is just heresy.
It's Canada's version of the tail of the dragon, or at least that's what the locals think. And it is beautiful scenery. You can see why so many Scottish settlers landed in Cape Breton and stayed there 200 years ago, because it looks just like Scotland. And, it's a beautiful ride. So I wrote this story, motorcyclists banned from the Cabot Trail. And we thought, no one's going to go for this. So we filled the story full of hints, we referred to local resident Angus McCaskill. Now, anybody from the east coast of Canada, or at least from Cape Breton, knows Angus McCaskill was Giant McCaskill. He's buried on the English Trail. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records, the strongest man who ever lived. He was the size of a buffalo, roughly. And this is documented. You can actually look him up. It was just full of all these little tidbits. But the crowning one that anyone should have picked up on was, we said, the move to ban motorcycles had come at the request of RV owners, because these RV owners were tired of getting slowed down by Harley Davidson riders in the hills and corners of the Cabot Trail. These motorhomes were tired of waiting. And I thought, nobody would ever believe that. Never thought anything of it. Got up, went about our day, got a call from Mark mid-morning. You need to take a look at this. Apparently, the story had been picked up in syndication by a larger website that hadn't done a whole lot of fact checking on it and hadn't stopped to think this story is ridiculous and it's April 1st. And this story got circulated worldwide. And we ended up getting a call, I believe, from the Cape Breton Tourism Board. And they were panicking, said, you have to take this story down. We're getting all these angry calls. So we went, took the story, made it very clear in the headline, I think, and then the first paragraph, this is a joke. And people just did not, they almost didn't believe us, it seemed, when we told them that was the case. Like, I have heard up to fairly recently, I haven't been riding in Cape Breton in a while, but up until the last couple of years, this happened quite some time ago. But for probably 5 years afterwards, people would say, oh, you're from the East Coast of Canada. It's really too bad about the Cabot Trail, you know, how they shut it down. We went to great lengths to stamp this out, and it was just a joke. It was never intended to deceive anybody. We thought, you know, some people think, ha ha, you know, this is, and I still bump into people, you know, or up until fairly recently, bumped into people who thought, oh no, you know, the Cabot Trail shut down. These stupid Canadians have cocked it up again. It was a very big lesson in the dangers of misinformation, even if it's all for fun.
You're listening to The Lowdown Show, presented by ADVrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. We're going to wrap things up with Zac today about a topic that I love, which is not so much the fantasy of the fantasy garage or the 8-bike solution or what, you know, anything of that nature, but what is the bike you actually own and why do you own it? And because there's so many factors, including, of course, cost. And so, Zac, let me throw it over to you and tell me about the bike you own at the moment and why did you get it and why do you like it, or do you like it?
Well, first of all, I would just like to point out that this sure looks to me like it's a fantasy garage. I mean, look at the decor. It's you can't pay for this. This is something you can only develop at your own time and expense. It's hand done. The bike that I own, well, I have a bunch of different bikes kicking around in various states of repair and disrepair. But the bike I just bought was a Yamaha Super Tenere, which is a bit of an odd choice for me. For years, I've always preached that you should buy lightweight motorcycles, you know, with enough power to do, say, 125 or 80 miles an hour, 85 all day. But that's all you need. And that's, I do believe that. I've often said a KTM 690 or a Husky 701 is all the motorcycle I really need. It would do everything from long haul touring to fairly rugged dirt bike stuff. But I bought the Super Tenere for one reason. It's because I wanted a Japanese BMW.
I thought you were going to say because it was cheap.
Well, that is true too. It was cheap. But no, I've been looking for one for a while. I wanted something that had shaft drive, the tubeless spoke wheels, ABS, traction control. I was on a couple of rides last year where I was out in some very foul weather and I had no real opportunity to get off the highway when I needed to. This was my own dumb decision. I should have stopped riding earlier in the day, but I didn't because I wanted to get home. So I was out in fairly bad weather and I thought to myself, if I had to make an emergency stop right now, I'm not sure that I could actually make a stop in minimal stopping distance and quick reaction time without ABS. I shouldn't be out in that kind of condition, but I am often. So I needed a bike that was a little more modern than my old Bandit or my DR650 or my RF 900, and I needed more legs than my old Yamaha WR. So I bought the Super Tenere. I have it apart. You can actually see the fork on the bench behind me. I'm replacing the fork seals. This bike has over 100,000 miles on it, so it's going to require some tickling and fettling to keep it on the road this summer. But I'm quite excited to ride it.
You really do have a bunch of your list of bikes. Your RF 900 DR What was the other one? Bandit. Those are the bluest
Yeah,
of blue. Those are the bluest of blue collar bikes, aren't they?
they are, and that's generally what I've bought over the years. I spent most of my riding time on my own bikes on a DR 650, and I still have it. It needs a rebuild. I dropped a valve a couple of years ago on a trip, and I bought a new engine for it in Toronto this winter. But the frame is needs some conditioning. The brake needs to be rebuilt. Just needs a bunch of work. So, and I also want to get my RF going again this year. I took the carbs off to rebuild them last winter and then just ran out of time to get them done before riding season. So this year I want to take the RF on a fairly long trip just to show that you can do fun things on a sport bike. You don't just have to go to do track days and smooth pavement.
Well, so that's a nice segue. Track days and smooth pavement, because that's of course my sweet spot. I've got two Ducatis. I had three Ducatis. I sold the 916 this winter. But I have a 888 Ducati vintage racer from the early 90s. And then I just rebought a bike that I owned briefly about 15 years ago, a 1993 900 SS Ducati, air-cooled two-valve, very simple. And when I owned the bike before, I only rode it once, and then I decided I needed a 916 because I needed something less comfortable for whatever reason. And so my brother bought the 900 off me, fell off, spooked himself, and sat in his garage for 10 years. So I bought it back last year, redid it, got it going again. And it's one of those bikes that is an absolute turd on a spec sheet. It's not very powerful. There's really nothing about it, and it looks like a sport bike, but it for whatever reason, it kind of just fits me. It's got raised clip-ons and the pegs are fairly low. And it's one of those bikes that's engaging at quasi-legal speeds. So it's engaging from, 60 to 80, 90 miles an hour, which is where you do most of your riding anyway. And I really love it. And and they're cheap. I got this, it was a $4,000 bike. And it's kind of it sits at this spot between, it's not a vintage bike with 18 or 19-inch wheels. It has 17-inch wheels, you put modern tires on it. And if you take care of it, and if you do the valves when you're supposed to and change the belts, they're actually really reliable. And it's just kind of the bike that fits me. And I know for a lot of people, it just wouldn't work because Ducatis are insistent. They're like an 8-year-old that won't stop talking when you ride them. They never disappear underneath you like a Japanese bike. But it has enough going on that I just find it's just a lovely bike to ride, and every kind of ride can somehow be engaged, even if the road's not very good. It can just be engaging to be on it. I don't know, it vibrates at the same tempo that my brain does, or something like that. And that it's inexpensive is that much better. And I think that's one of the things motorcyclists that we don't think enough of or aren't thankful enough for, which is that, if I was a car guy, there's no way I can go buy a 30-year-old Italian car, and have it as something that I can futz around with. But with motorcycles, there's enough stuff. There's lots of blue chip stuff, but there's enough stuff that we can play around and find interesting things, for not a lot of money. What did you pay for your Super Tenere?
I paid $4,000 at the dealer because of the mileage on it.
Yeah, so there's a bike with fairly modern amenities, and for $4,000. What can you get for $4,000? Can't buy anything.
The Bandit that I bought last year, I got it for $2,000, the 1200, and to me that was an absolute steal. A lot of people would say that a Bandit was a cheap motorcycle when it came out, and it was. But that air oil cooled Sachs 4-cylinder, just a beautiful engine to me. It's so workmanlike. It's like a 70s engine that somehow survived until the 2000s and was updated every 5 years or so along the way. That is a bike that I very much bonded with, and I wish it was just a little bit better on gravel roads. I bought it intending to use it for a tourer, and I converted it with some. It didn't take much: a new windshield, some heated grips, a luggage rack, a few things like that. And I used it in New Hampshire on tour on some gravel roads. I've used it around here, but the emotional part of me that says I love this bike, I want to ride it forever, got ruled out by the brain part of me that said the Super Tenere is what you need, young man. You know, that bike will go down a gravel road and not complain, and you'll rip off the exhaust on that Bandit, you idiot. So get rid of it. So it's up for sale right now, although I kind of secretly hope that nobody buys it.
You're listening to The Lowdown Show, presented by ADVrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. What's your guilty pleasure bike? What's the bike that you secretly desire that you don't necessarily want to admit that you desire? Do you have one of those?
Two of them. I don't make a huge secret of it, but they aren't bikes that people would expect me to want. One of them is a Honda NSR 250. I'm way too big for an NSR and way too unskilled to ride it to its potential. But when I was a kid, there was a lot of those bikes around in rural Prince Edward Island, because there was guys who would take containers full of muscle cars and ship them to Japan, and they would bring back these gray market 250s and 350s and 400s. So I grew up in this weird environment where those bikes were everywhere, and they were very well suited to Prince Edward Island because the speed limit is 90 kilometers an hour, which is about 55. So you could ride around in this 400 or 250, and I saw tons of these bikes, RZ 350s, Ninja 400s, but the one I really wanted was the NSR 250, and that's mostly because I had a Kickstarter. I just wanted a sport bike with a Kickstarter and this cool little V-twin two-stroke engine. The other bike is, and the name of it escapes me, but the predecessor to the SV1000, the V-twin that Suzuki made, and I can't think of the name of it. I can picture it in my brain, but my mind's going blank.
Is that is that the TLR?
Yes, the TLR. Yes.
Right.
I wasn't a sport bike fan in my younger years, and to this day, they're not my favorite machine. I like some of them, but I wouldn't go to the Oogle, or ogle a whole row of them at a dealership. But I remember the first time I saw a TL1000, I said, that is a bike that I would like to try. I would like to take it and just ride the wheels off it and see what it would do for me. I'm sure, again, my talent level of motorcycling is so low that it would be too much bike for me, but they sure look like they would be a lot of fun. You can call me crazy, but I think Suzuki nailed the styling in that era in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think it's just an awesome looking and cool bike, and that V-twin engine is still in production today and much updated in the 1050 V-Strom. So obviously it's a good design.
I think for me, and I'm a dedicated, I'm that guy, the espresso drinking Italian motorcycle fan. I'm as much a cliche as any Harley guy is, and I'm aware of it, which doesn't make it better. But I am aware of it. I have a real thing for like chopper panhead Harleys. In fact, there's a guy that I know has a 56 or 57 panhead engine in a chopper, and it's very much, it's built from sort of parts that he collected, and nothing is new, and it's got a really tacky flame paint job, but I just love the thing, and I don't know what it is about it. I mean, I know how horrible they are, and I know how vibratory they are, but for some reason, I think it's just it's that notion of imprinting, when you're young. And I just, in the town that I grew up in, there was lots of outlaw biker stuff going on. Satan's Choice was the big was the bike club in town, and I just think that notion of that there's something about that look of a bike from that era. And also the Panhead is a beautiful engine. It's a beautifully 45-degree V-twin compact, and there's just something about it that I just love. And if I ever had money, and I won't, which is good, but if I had money, I would spend a ridiculous amount of money and buy one. But I'd want one that was kind of wretched looking, because the more wretched they are, the better. In closing, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.